Good afternoon and welcome to TPM's panel discussion, Roe v. Wade, What's Next, where we'll sketch out what life looks like without a constitutional right to abortion. My name is Kate Riga. I'm a reporter in TPM's DC office and a co-host of the Josh Marshall podcast. It's really lovely to be with all of you, our TPM community, in what has been a particularly dark and tragic week. I'd like to extend our deepest gratitude to the members who fuel our operation and who made this event possible. We simply couldn't exist without you, and thank you very much. If you're not a member but enjoy our work, please consider joining. I'd also like to thank those who contributed to TPM's Journalism Fund, which helps to sustainably grow our editorial staff and to provide free memberships for students and those facing financial hardship. At any time during the event, feel free to submit a question in the Q&A chat at the bottom of your screen. If we have time towards the end, we'll answer some of them. As to who will be fielding those questions, I'm joined today by a top-notch panel of experts. Lauren Rankin is a writer, activist, and expert in abortion rights in the United States. She's the author of Bodies on the Line, At the Front Lines of the Fight to Protect Abortion in America, about the legacy of everyday volunteers in the fight for abortion rights in bookstores everywhere. Next, we have Kulsoom Ijaz, a staff attorney with the Center for Reproductive Justice. She's also a founding board member of the American Muslim Bar Association, where she is currently serving as the Advocacy Chair. And finally, we have Jennifer Haberkorn, a reporter covering Congress here in DC for the Los Angeles Times. Before arriving at the Times, she spent 8 years at Politico writing about healthcare policy, including the 2010 healthcare law, a story that took her to Congress, the states, healthcare clinics, and courtrooms around the country. Our panelist, Chanel Portia Albert, unfortunately could not attend due to a medical situation. Thank you all so much for being here. Let's jump right in. I'm going to start with questions directed at specific panelists, but if any other panelist wants to jump in afterwards, please do. So Lauren, you recently wrote about the Democratic Party's reluctance to really center and full-throatedly protect abortion rights over the past few decades. What do you make of the party's leaders' response now, and what do you think they should be doing?
I think it's deeply concerning that the Biden administration basically didn't have a plan for this when it seemed clear ever since Amy Coney Barrett was appointed to the court, and crystal clear since the oral arguments in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health in December, that this is where this was going, that Roe versus Wade was going to be overturned. It's indicative to me of the Democratic Party's use of abortion as a rallying cry for elections, but never really planning what they're going to do next. There are myriad options that the party could do right now. And I understand how the filibuster works. I know that we're not going to pass the Women's Health Protection Act without getting rid of that, and that's not happening. But there's a lot that the federal government can do, and they seem sort of stuck and shocked and confused about what to do. I understand all those feelings, but it's their job to be prepared to do what they can. And with the federal government, you have a lot of power. You have federal land that you could be using. You have resources that you could be dedicating. It seemed, and as soon as this leaked decision happened, the next day we saw Clyburn and Pelosi campaigning for the last anti-choice Democratic Congressman, Henry Queller, who is now sort of locked in this battle with Jessica Cisneros. That's unacceptable to me. We need a full-throated embrace from the Democratic Party. That should be the bare minimum.
Yeah, Jennifer, from a congressional viewpoint, we just had this kind of big show vote on the Women's Health Protection Act that predictably fell to the filibuster. Is it your sense that Congress-wise, they're trying to plan for anything else?
Well, they say that they are. And, I went up to many Democrats ahead of the vote and after the vote and said, what's next? And they kept saying, well, the first thing is to get everyone on the record. And, we all know where everyone stood. The only vote that changed between February, when they voted on this the first time, and May, Bob Casey said that he would vote for it if the bill itself was voted on upon the merits, which, frankly, was a little surprising that he changed his position. But, we know where everyone else stood. We know exactly where the fault lines are. No one seems to be changing. We know that Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski have their own bill that Democrats say is, not enough. They say it's not a full codification of Roe, so they're not willing to do it. But there's absolutely no discussion about what's next. And it's hard to see them really doing anything. I mean, Schumer has been pretty clear that he doesn't want to bring that Murkowski-Collins bill to the floor. And, some argue that that's half a loaf, that, if you can get that done, it's a little bit, but you really only pick up 2 Republicans. You might even lose some progressive Democrats, and you're nowhere near 60 to overcome the filibuster. And there's no real discussion at this point of carving out the filibuster for abortion. It wouldn't be successful at this point if it was. So everything everyone says is, well, we need to elect more Democrats who support abortion rights in November. I'm pretty skeptical that you get to 60. In 2009 and 2010, there were 60 Democrats in the Senate, which was, pretty remarkable in modern times. But, they were nowhere close to 60 Democrats who supported abortion rights, even at that time.
Yeah, you mentioned Bob Casey. How big of a shift is that? Like, what does that tell us about where the party has moved on abortion?
I think Casey's shift was pretty interesting, but it's been a slow process over the last several years. I mean, he has had 100% ratings with NARAL and Planned Parenthood in recent history. I can't remember exactly what year, but in recent history, he's had that. He did vote for the 20-week abortion ban a couple years ago. He's cast, votes like that. But he's been slowly, some call it an evolution. But the fact that he said he would vote for this bill, in February, he said he would only vote for cloture, the procedural vote to get on the bill. Now he's saying that he would actually vote for the bill itself.
Right. So we're going to kind of be bouncing around this whole time between all the different facets of this question. We have the political and the legal and, all this different stuff. So Kulsoom, how do you expect the legal landscape of fights over abortion to change after Roe is overturned?
Thank you for the question, Kate. I think what's important to note here is that whether the decision is rendered as currently drafted or whether the decision is just a 15-week ban, this is going to lead to a nationwide crisis. This will cause confusion and chaos surrounding where and when abortion can be accessed. And though decision day is when it'll start, it'll only be in the coming weeks and months that the full impact is felt, as the compounding harms of clinic closures, increased costs for procedures, and the enormous increase in numbers of patients that are going to show up at the remaining clinics is going to create delays and denials of care for all pregnant people in the United States. We know that pregnant people who carry unwanted pregnancies to term are more likely to face adverse health outcomes. They're more likely to fall into poverty and face increased risk of intimate partner violence. What's happening in Texas right now is just a preview of what's to come, right? Clinics in surrounding states are already overburdened due to out-of-state patients desperately searching for essential abortion care. And this will undoubtedly disproportionately impact Black, Indigenous, and people of color, people with disabilities, underserved communities, undocumented folks. Hostile states are already tripping over themselves, trying to prohibit people from accessing abortion across state lines, showing there are no limits to their cruel attempt to restrict people's decisional autonomy. Just yesterday in Oklahoma, the governor of Oklahoma just signed a total ban version of the Texas SB 8 law. The bill is immediately effective. It, abortion providers in the state stopped offering abortion services on Monday, but Oklahoma has now become the first state in the nation to have a total abortion ban in effect since Roe was decided. Again, abortion bans further systems of oppression. They deny Black, Indigenous, and people of color's access to rights. They're rooted in anti-Black racism, misogynoir, white supremacy, and other forms of oppression. I would argue that it's no coincidence that Black birthing people and children disproportionately face a maternal and infant mortality crisis in Mississippi. Mississippi has a maternal mortality rate of 29 per 100,000 live births for white folks, but the MMR for Black women is even higher at 54. And, at that rate, a Black pregnant or birthing person in Mississippi is more likely to face a maternal death than a woman in Palestine or Egypt. And I say that because we often look to post-colonial countries to advance this idea that the US is exceptional in some way, but the reality is so far from that assertion. There is so much retrogression and suffering that we need to account for. And these harms will only be compounded if the US Supreme Court overrules or undermines the decision in Roe.
Yeah. And this is a follow-up to that I think you guys can all kind of get in on because you've all written about this to some extent. But so far, we've seen red states kind of focusing their energy on heaping up restrictions on abortion and these gestational bans. And there's been a lot of energy driven towards that. If Roe is overturned completely, where do you expect that legislative energy to be channeled next?
Sure. Thanks, Kate. I think anti-abortion legislators are trying every possible tactic to undermine access, right? And we expect to see more of the same, including attempts at a federal ban and continued efforts to restrict access to contraceptives and medication abortion. There are these trigger bans in hostile states that are slated to go into effect if Roe will be overruled in whole or in part, depending on the hostile state. There are earlier pre-viability gestational bans that are coming up the pike. There are pre-Roe bans that are on the books. These are laws that predated the decision in Roe that criminalize the provision of abortion care, which can spring back into effect potentially if Roe is overruled or very seriously undermined. So those are kind of the things that we're seeing kind of shape up across the nation.
Right.
I'll just add on a little bit to that. I was
Yes,
talking to someone at Americans United for Life, one of the legislative groups in the anti-abortion effort. And, the way she was explaining it is, for all these years, their strategy has really been to work around existing legislation that, they were working on trap laws or things that undermined access. But now, if this ruling is what the draft says it's going to be, their strategy can completely change in that they can issue these outright bans. And, in the states that don't already have trigger laws in place, we're going to see those outright bans. I think, in states that are a little more purple or, have a legislature that's split, we're going to see a really intense fight. I think the Florida battle earlier this year is going to be indicative of that. There were some in the anti-abortion movement who felt like the 15-week ban wasn't enough, and they were frankly really aggravated that they had a Republican majority that couldn't do a complete ban or do something more aggressive than a 15-week ban. So in those states, we're going to see, is a 15-week ban the floor for what they try to accomplish. So I think we're going to kind of look at, I'm thinking about it in three buckets, the red states that are going to go, essentially a ban or as close to a ban as possible. The states in the middle that we're going to see this fight, do they do a full ban, a 15-week ban, or, things like that. And then, blue states that are going to try to expand access and do what they can.
I just want to note on that point, I actually wrote about this 4 talking points memo today, that we're seeing sort of the Republican shift on rape and incest exceptions, right? That used to be considered the standard. But it's always been the goal of anti-abortion advocates to get rid of all exceptions. And I'm talking including the life of the pregnant person, because if you view this issue in such a myopic way where the life of a fetus or a potential person overrides the life of the actual pregnant person. There is no instance in which it's justifiable. And I think what we're going to see, I'm sure you're going to get to the midterms, but this isn't going to stop at overturning Roe versus Wade. That was the first step for them in where they're going. And if Republicans manage to take back the Senate and the House of Representatives, and in 2024, the White House, they are going to try to pass a national ban on abortion. I'm not saying they will necessarily be successful, but that's where this is headed. So if you live in a pro-choice state, if you live in a state that protects abortion, that does not mean you are safe long-term. This is the beginning of the seed they planted so many years ago bearing fruit for them. And it's going to be the lives of pregnant people in every state that are going to suffer.
I think that's a really interesting point, because we have been seeing kind of the Overton window of how anti-abortion legislators and activists kind of talk about their goals shift in recent days since it became clear where the court is on this. And something that comes up a lot and has ever since the draft is, where is contraception kind of the next target? Is that going to be slotted in as kind of the new electoral carrot, compounded with these efforts to ban abortion completely? So, the question for anyone, but where do you think that is in this discussion? The idea of banning contraception or adding, hurdles to access it?
I think it's absolutely imperative. And the only reason I know that is because they said so in the leaked ruling. I mean, Alito could not have been more clear that he does not believe that the right to privacy exists anywhere in the Constitution. And the right to privacy, which was established as a fundamental right by the court in 1965 in Griswold v. Connecticut, was a case that determined that married people should be able to access contraception. All of these other rights, same-sex marriage, bans on anti-sodomy laws, they are all predicated on that fundamental right to privacy. And Alito said it doesn't exist. Even if we get a watered-down version of that ruling, we know where they're going. They've said it out loud. And if anyone earnestly thinks that they're not going to try to restrict those things, I think we're living in an understandable but regrettable delusion, because they've made it clear where they want to go.
Right. So one thing that's come up is, at least in the immediate future, it seems like we're headed for a country that's, bifurcated into abortion access in the democratically controlled states, prohibition in the red ones, and Jennifer, like you said, kind of perhaps some infighting in the purple ones. But we've already seen kind of nascent efforts from red states in particular to police people getting abortions even beyond their borders. That feels like an interjurisdictional dispute we haven't necessarily seen much of before. Kulsoom, is that your sense as well? Are there a lot of kind of cases to build off of here, or is this going to be kind of a novel landscape in this abortion debate?
I think before I start answering that question, I want to quickly mention the organization If, When, How. They're a wonderful reproductive justice org to plug in to learn more about this very issue of criminalizing abortion. They've dedicated their time and efforts to a campaign surrounding, for example, the decriminalization of self-managed abortions. And we know that pregnant and birthing people and medical providers, doulas, midwives, have been and will continue to be penalized or prosecuted for outcomes of pregnancy. Some of them will also be prosecuted or may also be prosecuted for unintended pregnancy loss. This will be another sword for discrimination. How this will play out across state lines is uncertain, as the laws vary from state to state. But what is certain is that we will be facing a national public health crisis, and we'll see that these laws will be used to further surveil, police, and incarcerate BIPOC communities disproportionately. At a time where we're facing several public health crises, from the COVID-19 pandemic to food insecurity, to shortages in baby formula, to school shootings, at a time where we should be investing in funding social and economic support for pregnancy, birthing, and parenting, we're witnessing a severe retrogression where hostile states are obstinate, like you said, in dedicating their efforts to compounding harms against BIPOC communities. And of course, if the decision in Mississippi is rendered as currently drafted, or even if it's just a 15-week ban, this will only get worse. And states will try to kind of do everything they can. Hostile states will try to do everything that they can to restrict access to this right even further.
Right. Oh, go ahead.
Kate, I was just going to add to your point about, are we going to see people criminalized for going to a different state? It's really interesting that we're seeing some states trying to push back against these efforts. And frankly, it's so new that they don't quite know how to do it. But, in California, they're trying hard the state legislature is trying hard to pass legislation that would protect California providers. If there's someone who is coming from a state where abortion is prohibited to California to get an abortion, would that provider be subject to turning over medical records or even face criminal repercussions in that state? And, I've talked to some of the folks who are working on this, and they say that they're doing all they can. And of course, the California state legislature is very supportive of abortion rights. So they're willing to, go pretty far in enacting legislation that would protect those providers. But even they admit that this is such novel, legal territory, which of course Kulsoom can probably speak better to, but they're not exactly sure how to fortify the state. We saw Connecticut do something similar, and I think we're going to see more blue states do the same, but they're trying to figure it out, frankly, as they go.
Is there a sense while they're crafting this legislation, like, are they trying to Supreme Court proof it in any kind of way, like with the understanding that one of these interjurisdictional disputes will almost certainly make it all the way to the high court?
Yeah, I think with anything on abortion rights and, particularly over state lines, it seems bound that it's going to go to the Supreme Court eventually.
Right. So one piece of this is that I think politically overturning Roe has played a really important role for the Republican Party in an electoral sense, in that it's been a big motivator for voters. We saw, especially during the Trump time, like there were a flurry of stories about people who were like, I don't like him, but he's going to put anti-Roe judges on the court, so that's enough. If we are coming to a world where Roe is overturned, and this for any of you, but what do you see the movement kind of slotting in to be that next, here's why we need you to vote. Here's why we need you to vote all the way down the ticket and all the way to the top. What is that next issue that'll be that electoral carrot, or will it just be another piece of the abortion kind of battle?
I think, and everyone else, please, chime in. I think that it will continue to be abortion. Overturning Roe, as I said, was only the beginning of this journey for them. But it's part of a larger worldview. And we're seeing that in so many different ways. Restrictions on access to voting, restrictions on other kinds of healthcare that are not abortion related, banning gender affirming care for trans youth. All of these things are part of this worldview that right now we're dealing with, an epidemic continually of gun violence. We're literally having second, third, and fourth graders be murdered in school. And instead, what we're talking about from a Republican legislation standpoint is banning abortion and banning trans bathrooms. Those kinds, I think that party is really horrifyingly adept at taking something that has absolutely nothing to do with the myriad crises we're facing in this country. And it's the 2004ification. George W. Bush ran on opposition to same-sex marriage instead of the Iraq War, and he won. I think we're going to see all of these things be conflated because they're all part of the same worldview, which is reifying white male cisgender power. And I think abortion and banning abortion, not just in hostile states, but nationwide, will continue to be a huge push for the Republicans.
I'm really interested in this question as well. And I tend to agree that overturning Roe, yes, was this if it happens, is going to be this juggernaut for the anti-abortion movement and for the Republican Party. But it's not the end of the story. It's a personhood amendment to the Constitution. And, whether that's something that they're going to be able to achieve in the near future, I don't know, but that's the driving force here. And overturning Roe is merely a step in that process. And as Lauren said, there's still going to be states that support abortion rights and where abortion access is going to exist. So, that effort toward a federal ban, I think is going to continue to drive Republicans. And what I'm interested in particular is this moment, if Roe is in fact overturned, is it going to further energize the Republican voters who were so motivated, as you said, Kate, why they voted for Trump in the first place in some cases? Is this going to re-energize them and say, we got this victory, like, let's keep going? Or is it going to merely galvanize the other side and bring Democrats out? And, I think it's too early to know the answer to that question, but that's one thing that I'm going to be particularly interested in the months to come.
Yeah. So for particularly congressional Republicans, Jennifer, where have they kind of positioned themselves on this question of would Republicans pass a nationwide abortion ban as soon as they get the requisite government control?
So technically they're saying no.
Okay.
Josh Hawley in the days after the leak said, no, I don't support a federal ban. He supports, this being a state decision. Mitch McConnell.
Did we have a freeze?
I'm happy to jump in on her behalf and just say that even if Josh Hawley is saying, let's take Josh Hawley. No one should be taking Josh Hawley at face value. The idea that I don't actually think this party cares about banning abortion. They care about using these issues to further their own power. They hate abortion because they hate pregnant people and they hate people with uteruses, but the whole point is actually not to ban abortion. The whole point is to galvanize and radicalize voters so that they're able to maintain power. So if we're looking to Mitch McConnell and saying, you sound so moral and upstanding here that you're never going to vote on this, no one should buy that. That's just my thought.
Yeah.
That sounds so cynical, but it's true.
We're living in cynical times. Kulsoom, one thing you mentioned earlier were these trigger laws that a lot of states have on the books. And I think we've kind of used that phrase to talk about a wide swath of laws, including ones passed, relatively recently to take effect if Roe falls. But then also some states like, Wisconsin and Michigan have these very old pre-Roe bans that are still dustily languishing in the books. Is there any question about if these would spring to life immediately if Roe is overturned, or is there any legal murkiness around if a law from, 1931 goes live right away?
Sure. I think I can speak to, so with Michigan, there's a 1931 abortion ban that's on the books.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a total ban on the provision of abortion care. It's a felony law. It was enjoined by the Michigan courts to the extent that it conflicts with Roe. So very recently, the governor's office in Michigan and Planned Parenthood filed a case seeking to block this law from springing back into effect if the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court decides to either overrule Roe head on or to very seriously undercut it. Very recently, there was a preliminary injunction that was issued by the Court of Claims, the lowest court in Michigan, to block the law from springing back into effect during the pendency of this case. There are efforts being taken to say that even if whether Roe is overruled or very seriously undermined by the U.S. Supreme Court, there are still protections under Michigan's state constitution that enshrine kind of this right to to bodily integrity and the right to accessing safe and effective abortion care. So that's one way and one example of how these pre-Roe bans can be challenged, or virtually any of these laws can be challenged, right? If we can no longer rely on, our federal court to make it happen, maybe we can look to see whether there are state procedural or constitutional inroads to be made. So that's one example. And I think you had asked something about a question about the trigger bans, and I'm trying to remember what exactly that was.
I was just wondering about your sense of whether these kind of old laws would come back into effect immediately, or if you expect kind of litigation around whether they go live right away.
Right. So that's just one example of one way a law could spring back into effect once the decision is rendered by the U.S. Supreme Court. Trigger bans are a little different. Those are newer legislations that are created by state legislatures that basically, they vary state by state. They vary from hostile state to hostile state. And they basically have to do with, pre-viability gestational bans going into effect or being triggered if and when Roe is overruled or very seriously undermined. They can go into effect just by the decision being rendered, or some states have it so the AG's office will certify that Roe has been overruled or very seriously undermined, giving legitimacy to the trigger ban to go into effect. So those are some other ways that hostile states will be seeking to restrict, curtail, and ban abortion services in the state.
Do you see state constitutions as going to play a large part in the litigation going forward? You mentioned Michigan, and I know in Kansas, there's kind of an all-out war over their constitution, which maybe you could explain a little bit for our audience.
I think so. I think I can speak to like Michigan as an example. Their constitution was most recently updated in 1963 during the civil rights era. It provides arguably broader protections for individual rights than the federal constitution even does. They've got this very robust, equal benefits clause, for example. They've got a robust equal protection clause, and I think. We are going to see efforts being used to argue for broader protections for pregnant and birthing people under state constitutions, just because of the landscape of what the U.S. Supreme Court is looking like now. So right. I think that's right.
Jennifer, welcome back. We are glad that you rejoined us.
I'm so sorry. My computer crashed. Apparently does not like this conversation.
Lauren, one thing I wanted to ask you about is you mentioned kind of the white supremacist roots of the anti-abortion movement. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so I understand I'm a white woman explaining this, so it seems a little odd. Dorothy Roberts, who is a reproductive justice expert, yes, Killing the Black Body. If you haven't read it, please read it. She really astutely explains some of this, but really the modern anti-abortion movement gained roots in the 70s, actually as a way to oppose segregation. Jerry Falwell, who created the Moral Majority, was deeply anti-integration and wanted to keep segregation, which had been overturned in Brown versus Board of Education, on the books. And so the movement really galvanized around abortion as a way to start mobilizing white evangelical voters who normally were not, if you can imagine, not particularly politically involved, but also didn't like the idea of sitting next to a Black person on a bus or sending your children to integrated schools. And really, opposition to abortion is the first tier in controlling who gets to reproduce the nation. And that sounds a little heady, but if people who have uteruses are able to decide for themselves whether or not they're going to have children, then that takes the control in terms of who reproduces the nation, who becomes a citizen, who is born, the demographics. We're seeing this with this great replacement theory, absolute racist nonsense. banning abortion is a central tier to controlling how the nation is reproduced and how citizenship becomes reproduced. And once you ban abortion, then you, and I'm talking you as like the white man in power, they're able to shape how all of the other policies go into effect. That's why voting rights recessions are happening alongside this. It's really one and the same. So please read Dorothy Roberts. She says this way more eloquently than I ever could, but these movements have been part and parcel since the very beginning, and they share the same long-term goal. And they have the votes on the Supreme Court right now, and they don't really care how unpopular it might be politically.
Yeah, I just want to add on to what Lauren had so powerfully stated. I mean, again, I would also really encourage folks to pick up this book. It very powerfully lays out this country's sordid history of denying Black pregnant and birthing people's rights to bodily integrity, decisional autonomy, and their rights to be free from reproductive coercion since this nation's inception, starting with forced labor and birth under bondage. And then I kind of want to layer some of this and say that, in the 1850s, a physician and anti-abortion activist by the name of Horatio Storer, he led a nationwide campaign to pass abortion bans state by state. And this campaign was driven in part by racist, sexist, and nativist motivations of demographic control to ensure a white majority country. There's a historian's brief that was filed in our case with the Center for Reproductive Rights in the Mississippi case, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, that takes a deep dive into Storer's campaign too, that folks can look into.
Excellent. So one question I've been thinking a lot about that I think, any of you can speak to, there's this dynamic, I think, where the anti-abortion movement has been pretty successful in its messaging, or at least making that messaging very ubiquitous and kind of singing from the same songbook. And that, I think, encompasses everything from calling themselves pro-life to, fetal heartbeat bills. It's kind of infiltrated everywhere. And I think, I wrote a story about this where one expert told me it's a lot harder to fit nuance on a bumper sticker than it is to just write, save the babies. So how can that piece, especially the piece that deals with kind of medical disinformation about what abortion is and what effects it has on women and like all of those things, how can that be combated in a political environment where we've seen disinformation has flourished?
I'm happy to start off here with
this very large question.
Yes. For starters, if you can't even say the word abortion, it's really hard to defend the thing. So for years, a lot of national Democrats, and not all, but a lot of national Democrats have really bent over backwards to avoid saying this word. Right to choose, bodily autonomy, which are all things and are all great. But what are you talking about? Because if you can't say the word, it's not Voldemort. You're not going to be incinerated. So if you can't actually say the word abortion, then the thing that you claim you're defending immediately just becomes stigmatized and weird. And so I think we can start by saying the word abortion. I support access to safe and legal abortion, period. That's it. And when someone, the conversations that you're having, people in this country also don't understand the hijacking of language that abortion opponents have done. Partial birth abortion is not a thing. After birth abortion is not a thing. The language that they're using is inflammatory, non-medical, and non-scientific. And it's up to reporters. And, TPM is one of the few reporting sites, I think, that does this very well, to avoid using that language and reinforce what the actual language is. But at the base of it, abortion is about people. People have abortions, people need abortions. And if we're talking about this issue as a political fight, rather than a matter of fundamental human dignity, we are missing the entire point.
That was really beautifully said, Lauren. I think that's exactly right. I think, yeah, this weaponization of language, like the heartbeat bill, it's based on junk science. We've had folks that are medical experts that have come out and said, fetal cardiac activity does not mean we have a fully formed heart or an organ, or that it's a heartbeat by any like layman's understanding of what that term means. I think also, a lot of folks don't understand that pregnancy is a medical condition. And if what is so entirely offensive about some of Amy Coney Barrett's, kind of talking points about safe havens is completely missing the point about that being a complete reality, how hypertension and diabetes and other chronic health conditions that disproportionately impact BIPOC communities can make carrying a pregnancy to term unsafe and dangerous. I think that's really important to highlight. I think it's also important, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought, but it's also important to highlight that somebody had mentioned this to me, that no one is ever forced to donate their organs after they pass away, right? But somehow in this country, we find it okay to force a pregnant person to carry a pregnancy to term, right? To give up the course of their life, their health, their safety in order to do that. And that juxtaposition was very powerful for me, that even after death, a person is not required to donate an organ in order to, further some state interest. But for some reason, we are okay with forcing pregnant people to risk their safety and their lives to carry a pregnancy to term.
I just wanted to hop back to something Lauren mentioned a minute ago about how Democrats have kind of struggled a little bit saying the word abortion. And I think we've seen many Democrats improve on that in recent months. But, there's still this effort to get Joe Biden to say the word abortion. And he put it in a press release one time. I don't think he's actually said it verbally. And so it is kind of a challenge for the party if they're not willing to say the term. How can you defend it? How can you eloquently defend it? And I think, if and when this decision comes down as it is expected, there's going to be a lot of pressure on Biden at that point to come out forcefully. I mean, if you remember, he was the last Democrat in the primary to even come out in support of repealing the Hyde Amendment, the ban on federal funding of abortion. And, there were a lot of skeptics in the Democratic Party that, is he really the guy who's going to be an ardent defender of something that's so important to the Democratic Party? And now here we are with Roe potentially being overturned, and he's the, person leading the party. And so I think that's why we're going to see, Vice President Harris take a more active role here, because she is clearly more comfortable talking about reproductive rights and has, frankly, more credibility in the Democratic Party.
That's interesting. And I think the history of kind of Democrats and the pro-choice movement in general struggling with how to frame it, what to call it. It wasn't that long ago that safe, legal, and rare was the tagline, despite the fact that, 1 in 4 women in America will have an abortion by the end of their reproductive age. So when we look forward, and obviously Democrats are going to want to use Roe being overturned to galvanize voters for the midterms, like you were talking about earlier, Jennifer, how do you see Democrats messaging that, or how should they kind of drive people towards this one purpose? And will they be able to do that given what you all just discussed, the difficulty that Democrats traditionally have with even saying the word abortion?
Well, they're certainly going to try. We're seeing the Democratic Party, gearing up for November, saying we need to elect pro-choice Democrats in a way that we have not seen in the past. But this election is going to be the first test of, is abortion a galvanizing issue for Democratic voters in the way it had been for Republican voters for so many years? I've asked a lot of Democrats this question in the hallways in the Capitol, what's going to be are you confident that this is going to be a motivating issue for your voters? And the only evidence they point to is that the overturning of Roe is real now, and that reality could be the thing that smacks voters in the face and gets Democrats to turn out in a way that they haven't before. And again, whether that happens, we'll find out in November. But for 30 years, this has been a galvanizing issue for Republicans, and the criticism among Democrats has been that there's not enough Democratic voters who remember life pre-Roe, or that will make abortion their number one issue at the ballot box. And this is going to be their test.
I also want to add on to that, well said, Jennifer, that we're all talking about, will Democrats show up in November? Which Democrats? Because the Supreme Court has also recently allowed a bunch of really regressive voting restrictions to go into effect. So, I'm already girding myself to hear in November how Black Democrats didn't show up, without any context for how their right to actually vote has been eradicated. You can easily galvanize people if you're only galvanizing a certain number of people, but Democratic voters for 50 years, the backbone of that party has been Black women, and those votes are systematically being chipped away. I also think, for 30 years, Democrats have been more than happy to run on Roe's at risk, and yet we don't have a plan. Like, Roe's at risk, okay, yes, Roe, like, the boy cried wolf. Well, the wolf is now in the house, so you had no plan for when the wolf was coming. And it's hard. Obviously, I think you need to vote for politicians and elected officials who support this basic right. But having something more than just a talking point would be really helpful. And using language where you say the word. I think I'm really afraid that the party is going to end up, or media at writ large is going to end up, blaming the very voters who've been disenfranchised for not showing up to vote for the thing that they needed and wanted to vote for. And I just want us to be really cautious of that going into November.
Is a piece of that emotional as much as it is messaging? I remember in the days after the leak, Elizabeth Warren kind of went outside and there were all of these protesters and she was visibly very upset. And I think that struck a lot of people, particularly because it was in the midst of this time where, there were protests at Kavanaugh's house, and we had Dick Durbin saying, well, that's very inappropriate. And the press secretary saying, we don't like that. And I think there is a piece of this that's just people wanting to see some kind of like raw emotion from their lawmakers, or some anger, or some, understanding of how big a deal this is going to be to so many people. And I wonder, is that something that you guys think Democrats will try to be better at? Is this something they can shake old habits of being a bit, of downplaying things, or prioritizing civility above sometimes kind of the root of the issue?
I just think it's absurd for the Democratic Party to claim or to ask civility of people who are being oppressed. Please be nicer about the fact that someone's foot is on your neck. No, obviously no one is advocating for violence here, but that's not what's been happening. And we've turned this conversation into, is it really proper to protest outside of Kavanaugh's house? Instead of, was it proper for Dr. George Tiller to be shot and killed in church? Was it proper for Dr. Bart Slepian to be shot and murdered in his kitchen after coming home from synagogue? We're not having that conversation. And Dick Durbin, come on, boo, grow a pair of ovaries. It is time. This is the moment. I think demanding civility from people who are being oppressed and who are trying to end their own oppression is absurd.
Yeah, I think, Jennifer, one piece of this is that specifically in Congress, it's a bit hard for Democrats, I think, to rouse a lot of, excitement or passion or drive, because we have the filibuster lingering over everything and making legislative change all but impossible right now. And I think the message of well, you voted for us in 2020, but we need you to give us more senators so we can pass this stuff is like a bit less inspirational. How have you seen them kind of trying to thread that needle?
I totally agree. It's hey, we delivered you the White House, the House, the Senate, but you can't do anything with it. And Democrats are confronting this, of course, on every issue that they want to advance on. Right now, gun reform. They can't go anywhere despite having these majorities. And I just don't think it's going to be a very impassioned message this fall if they're saying, you've done this for us in the past, you delivered these things, and now give us even more. We promise this time we'll do something with it. And it's true, if you break down the numbers, they don't have 50 votes to overturn the filibuster. They don't have 50 votes on abortion rights. They don't have 50 votes on gun rights. So even if the filibuster didn't exist, there's things that they wouldn't be able to do, namely Joe Manchin. But I think it's going to be challenging for the average voter who's doesn't know these details, but understands that Democrats have controlled Washington for 2 years and what has changed. And so I think it's going to be a tough needle to thread. That's why you are seeing Democrats who are going to the point of saying we need to elect more pro-choice Democrats, making the point that they don't have that majority today.
Right. Okay, I think we're going to take a few audience questions here. This one is from Ralph, and anyone feel free to jump in. He says, why not try to put together a bill that can get 50 votes? When it fails due to the filibuster, vote on a filibuster carve out. Then we can have a rock solid number of how many seats we need to pick up to nuke the filibuster and codify Roe.
I can tackle this. So Democrats have kind of addressed this. They've talked about, should they just do this Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins bill, which would, in Democrats' perspective, not do enough to codify Roe. It wouldn't go as far as they need it to do because states would still have some ability to enact abortion restrictions. But they don't have 50 votes for that bill plus undoing the filibuster to do it. So that's not a really great marker because 2 Republicans, even if they support the bill, are never going to go along with overturning the filibuster for, while Democrats are in charge. So, really the best marker we have is the vote on the Women's Health Protection Act a couple weeks ago. And they are still, far short of a filibuster-proof majority. But yeah, you could break down every single senator's position, and it is pretty clear, or you could come to a clear conclusion on how many votes you would need.
Do you all think that there's worth in doing these show votes that Democrats have done on various issues, kind of, votes that are destined to fail against the filibuster, but they say, but everyone's on the record and the public can see where they stand. Do you think there's merit in doing those, or are they just kind of a demonstration of Democrats' inability to pass legislation in this moment at this point?
I think there could be merit in it if they did anything after it. Like just having the vote and being like, well, here's the record. Okay, and now what? But we know where everyone stands on this issue. We do. And you could literally propose, Joe Biden could propose a bill right now that would say we will provide milk for all babies for the end of time. And it wouldn't matter what the bill said. Republicans will not vote to support that legislation. That's how it is. Mitch McConnell has that whole group rallied. They're not voting for anything. So continuing to have these votes isn't really going to do a whole lot. If you're going to have them, then use that as a talking point or leverage in some other way. But you can't just be having these votes and saying, well, we tried. Did you? What else? What else have you tried? Let's get a little creative, folks. We're at the end of Roe. It's time to start getting creative. And that's just not coming.
Yeah, I mean, this might be an obvious question at this point, but I think the point of some of these show votes were to put pressure on Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin to show that, 48 of your buds are on board. You guys are in a tight spot, but is there any pressuring them at this point? Have we passed that point? Is the opposition to the filibuster just baked in now?
Yeah, and I think, in some ways, Manchin and Sinema enjoy being in this position. And so, yeah, they could keep bringing these up, but Sinema and Manchin enjoy being, we're not going along with everything the Democrats want to do. They
we're
need
talking
to be in
about
that
them
position
right now.
Yeah, exactly.
That's all they want.
Yeah, though this continues to baffle me from the Kyrsten Sinema standpoint, because I don't know, with Manchin, it kind of makes sense. He's from West Virginia, right? It's like Democrats are not going to say, well, as soon as we have you out of there, we're going to replace you, Joe. Like, that's a much harder sell than saying that from Arizona. Do any of you guys have pet theories about what is Kyrsten Sinema doing? What is this strategy? Why does she think she's going to get reelected if she acts like this? Anyone? Is there no answer to this question? Is that the answer?
I genuinely think Kyrsten Sinema loves the fact that her and Joe Manchin otherwise would be, Joe Manchin has a long history, but Kyrsten Sinema would otherwise be one of a giant group of Democratic senators, many of whom most people here could not even name. And yet we all know the name Kyrsten Sinema, and that is probably for her the entire point. That would be my guess. I think it's futile, and I don't think they will change this at all.
And she clearly is trying to get some John McCain maverick-y type of reputation. The difference being that McCain, was able to do something with his maverickness, and it's unclear what Sinema is actually trying to accomplish here. And, frankly, to your point, Kate, she's very vulnerable to a primary in Arizona. And I think it's almost, a primary challenge is going to do very well against her if she continues along this path, because Democrats are so frustrated that she is on some of these things single-handedly or, second-handedly preventing them from doing anything.
Right. Okay, we're just about at time. So I just want to ask one final question, which is that, we've heard from a lot of people who are in varying states of despair at this moment because they feel like the Supreme Court is so far right and so relatively young that, there's no way out for the foreseeable future. And they've had months of hearing about how the midterms are a super hostile climate for Democrats, and it's going to be an uphill climb and all this stuff. And I think some people are wondering what they can do. They're feeling a bit powerless. So do any of you have ideas about people who support abortion rights and this whole other, gamut of issues that the Supreme Court is threatening? What can they do?
I think for me, for my position has always been, we hope that this will motivate voters, right? I'm choosing to have this kind of defiant hope that this will galvanize people in a sustained way, because as you can see, my role as an attorney is very extremely limited, and every bit of progress that we've made in this country has stemmed from people power. And so to the extent that we can encourage folks to pursue proactive protections beyond the court by supporting providers, patients, abortion funds, reproductive justice organizations, and clinics on the ground. And a plug for Liberate Abortion. They're an amazing organization that provides resources to folks state by state on how to become more civically engaged on this issue. There are different kinds of campaigns happening state by state to advance state protections, not only through existing laws, but through constitutional reforms. There are ballot initiatives. There's a ballot initiative that's on the books in Michigan right now. So, and that they're collecting signatures to enshrine this right to abortion in the Michigan Constitution. And, to continue to support the federal protections that folks have been mentioning, like WIPA, the Women's Health Protection Act, and really holding our representatives' feet to the fire, and not only demanding that WIPA be passed, but really to eliminate, the Hyde Amendment from our federal budget, passing the EACH Act so that people, regardless of their background, regardless of their income, can actualize this right to safe and effective abortion care in this country. Because unless and until we do that as well, WIPA is not the end, right? Like that's not WIPA is the floor, I should say.
I also want to say, I think we need to think beyond voting. That does not mean don't vote. That does not mean don't vote. Vote. Voting is important. But, part of what I detailed in my book, Bodies on the Line, is that since the beginning of legal abortion in this country, it's been under attack, and the federal government really didn't do anything. The Supreme Court certainly didn't do anything to protect abortion providers and clinics that were under attack from folks. It's been everyday people. And I know that sounds less glamorous, but ask yourself, what can you do today to make somebody's life better? What can you do today to make abortion a little bit more accessible? I know donating $10 to an abortion fund sounds boring. It's not boring to the person who needs that $10. If you want to be a clinic escort, like the people in my book, like contact your local clinic, find out how you can get involved. It can't just be voting. Voting is one of many facets we have here. And I will also say that for the vast majority of this country's history, the Supreme Court has been a literal dumpster fire. So for a brief period of time, we had a solid, some semblance of progress, and yet marginalized people, particularly Black, Brown, Indigenous, and queer people in this country, have suffered for centuries, and they are still here, and they are still resilient. So find it in yourself, particularly those of us who have privilege, find it in yourself to say, I understand despair. I'm going to choose action today. That's all that you can do.
Great. Okay, I think that wraps things up for today. Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists. We appreciate you so much. Our members and to all who donated to TPM's Journalism Fund. I think we have a lot to chew on, and I hope you'll join us for more events like this in the future. Thank you, everyone, so much, and have a good rest of your day.